You already know. Deep down, you already know that the life you are living right now is not the life you were built for. 97 out of every 100 people will retire broke, dependent, or dead before they ever taste the freedom they spent their whole lives promising themselves. Why do those who try hardest fall further? That question should burn in your chest, like an ember that never quite goes out. Because the answer is not what you expect, and it will change everything if you let it. There is a man right now, sitting at a kitchen table, somewhere in this world. The lamp above him hums with a thin electric buzz. The room smells of cold coffee and old paper. His shoulders curve forward under a weight that has no name on it, no label, no visible shape, yet it presses down on his sternum like a stone resting directly on his lungs. He is not lazy. He is not stupid. He gets up before the alarm sounds. He works longer than his contract demands. He says yes when he means no. He skips lunches. He swallows pride like a daily vitamin. And at the end of every month, the numbers on his bank statement tell him the same merciless story. It is not enough. It was never enough. And he cannot explain why, because he has been trying so hard for so long that trying itself has become the identity he wears instead of success. You recognize it. Maybe you recognize him because you have sat at that same table, felt that same invisible stone. Maybe you recognize him because you are still sitting there right now, wondering why the effort never compounds the way the books said it would. And here is where most people make the most catastrophic error of their entire financial lives. They conclude that the problem is the effort itself, that they simply need to try harder, work longer, sacrifice more. So they add more hours to an already bleeding schedule. And the stone gets heavier, and the coffee gets colder. And the years pass like pages torn from a calendar that nobody bothered to read. The truth, the real truth that Napoleon Hill spent more than 20 years excavating from the minds of the wealthiest and most powerful human beings who ever walked this earth, is something almost no one is willing to say plainly. So it will be said here, without apology and without softening. The problem is not your effort. The problem is that your effort is not consistent. Not consistent in the way that matters. Not consistent at the level of the mind, at the level of the invisible architecture that governs every decision, every action, every result your life produces. You have been working consistently at the surface while your subconscious mind runs a completely different program underneath. A program installed by fear, by other people's opinions, by years of watching scarcity behave as though it were permanent. And that program is costing you everything. If you have ever felt the frustration of working hard and going nowhere, if you have ever looked at someone with less apparent talent than you who somehow accelerates past you financially, if you have ever gone to sleep at night with a knot in your stomach that feels like unfinished business with your own potential, then what follows in these next minutes is not optional information. It is a conversation you were supposed to have years ago. It is the conversation that separates the 97 from the 3. Stay with this. Every word from here forward was earned, not invented. There is something that happens inside a human being when the gap between who they are and who they know they could be becomes wide enough to feel every single day. That gap has a texture. It feels like the scratchy fabric of a chair you have been sitting in too long, uncomfortable but familiar enough that standing up seems harder than it actually is. It smells like stagnation, like recycled air in a room with no window open. It has a sound, the sound of another week ending, exactly like the one before it. The soft, terrible sameness of a life running on repetition without progression. Hill observed this gap in the lives of hundreds of men and women across decades of research. He sat across from industrialists who had built empires from nothing, and from men who had been given every advantage and squandered it. He listened, he measured, he asked the one question that almost nobody else was asking. What is the actual difference between those who accumulate great wealth and those who spend their lives in financial servitude? And the answer that came back, again and again, from Andrew Carnegie, from Henry Ford, from Thomas Edison, from scores of others whose names became synonymous with creation and abundance, was not intelligence. It was not luck. It was not even talent. It was consistency of thought, the disciplined, daily, non-negotiable habit of holding a clearly defined desire in the conscious mind until the subconscious had no choice but to accept it as instruction. Mira, this is not metaphor. This is not motivational poetry designed to make you feel warm for 40 minutes and then dissolve like sugar in rain. This is the documented, reproducible mechanism by which ordinary human beings have built extraordinary lives since the beginning of recorded civilization. The consistency that produces wealth is not the consistency of showing up to a job. It is the consistency of commanding your own mind every morning before the world gets its hands on your attention. Why do those who try hardest fall further? Because trying hardest at the wrong level of reality produces exhaustion. Not results, You can try very hard to swim while someone has tied an invisible weight to your ankle, and everyone watching will admire your effort while you slowly sink. The weight is an inconsistent mind. The weight is a subconscious pattern that has not been given clear enough instructions, repeated with enough emotional intensity, to override the default setting of limitation. Now you need to understand what is actually at stake here. Not for you alone, because if this were only about you, perhaps the urgency would be manageable. Perhaps you could afford to take your time to ease into new habits gradually, to explore self-improvement at a comfortable pace. But this is not only about you. This has never been only about you. And this is the part of the conversation that most teachers of success are too polite to say directly. There is a child somewhere in your life. Whether it is a child you are raising right now, or a child you will raise, or a child who watches you the way children watch everything, with absolute unfiltered attention, absorbing not what you say but what you do, not your instructions but your example. That child is learning right now what money means. That child is absorbing right now the emotional temperature that surrounds financial conversations in your home. That child is internalizing the posture of your shoulders when the bills arrive, the tone of your voice when you talk about work, the specific quality of silence that fills the room when the subject of the future comes up. And whatever program is running in your mind right now, whatever relationship with scarcity or abundance lives in your nervous system, is being transmitted to that child with the fidelity of a broadcast tower, whether you intend it or not. Hill documented this transmission with devastating precision. He observed that the children of men who carried the consciousness of poverty, even when those men worked desperately hard, almost always inherited that consciousness. Not the poverty itself, but the belief system that produces poverty, the invisible instruction manual for smallness, for settling, for making peace with less than one deserves. And those children grew up and transmitted it to their children, and so the chain of financial servitude continued across generations, not because of lack of opportunity, but because of lack of the right mental instruction. Whereas, what you do with your mind in the next several months will not only determine your own financial future, it will determine whether your children spend their adult lives fighting the same invisible weight that you are fighting right now, or whether they stand on a foundation of mental abundance that makes accumulation natural, that makes opportunity visible, that makes wealth feel like the normal and expected result of focused, purposeful effort. The stakes are generational. The urgency is real, and the window, the specific window of time during which you can most powerfully and efficiently reprogram the patterns that govern your results, does not stay open indefinitely. Because here is the other truth that comfort will never tell you. Time is the one resource that does not respond to effort, does not reward good intentions, and does not wait for readiness. Every single day that passes without a deliberate, consistent practice of mental alignment is a day in which the default program continues to run, producing the default results, compounding in the wrong direction. Why do those who try hardest fall further? Because effort without the right mental foundation is like pouring water into a vessel with a crack at the bottom. The pouring feels productive. The sound of the water is encouraging, but the crack is silent and invisible and patient, and the vessel never fills. Here is what Hill understood about the human mind that his contemporaries, and frankly most people even now, completely failed to grasp. The subconscious mind does not evaluate, it does not judge, does not analyze, does not distinguish between what is desirably and what is destructive. It simply accepts with perfect obedience whatever the conscious mind presents to it with sufficient repetition and sufficient emotional charge. It is the most powerful creative force in the known universe, and it is running your financial life right now based on instructions that were installed in you before you were old enough to consent to them. This is not philosophy. This is function. The subconscious mind controls the vast majority of your daily decisions, including your financial decisions, not through deliberate reasoning, but through pattern recognition. It scans the environment, matches what it sees to the patterns it has stored, and generates the response that matches those patterns. If the stored pattern says money is scarce, dangerous, difficult to keep, or somehow morally suspect, then every financial opportunity that arrives in your life will be unconsciously processed through that filter. And you will find reasons not to act, reasons to hesitate, reasons why this particular opportunity is probably not for you. The pattern protects itself by generating evidence for its own truth. This is why intelligent, hardworking, morally serious people stay broke. Not because the universe is unfair, though it can feel that way from inside the pattern, but because the program running underneath their conscious intentions is generating invisible friction against every forward movement, and they are exhausting themselves pushing against resistance they cannot see, and therefore cannot address. Ficate, Hill spent time with a man who had lost everything not once but 3 times. Different industries, different decades, different circumstances, and yet the same result each time. Accumulation followed by collapse. This man came to Hill not for sympathy, but for diagnosis. He wanted to know why, and Hill sat with him in a small office that smelled of wood polish and tobacco. And he asked him to describe the moment each time, right before the collapse. And the man described, with remarkable consistency across all three experiences, the same internal state. A quiet but persistent belief, running just beneath the surface of his confidence, that it was probably too good to last, that he had probably gotten further than he deserved, that something would eventually correct the imbalance. He had never said this out loud. He had never consciously endorsed the belief, but it was there, installed it early, running faithfully and 3 times. It had found a way to make itself true. Hill told him, "The thought you hold with the greatest emotional intensity, regardless of whether you consciously want it or fear it, is the thought your subconscious accepts as instruction. You have been instructing your subconscious to engineer a correction, and it has obeyed you perfectly, every single time. The problem is not your business decisions. The problem is the thought you are allowing to run unchallenged in the background." That conversation changed the trajectory of that man's life. Not because Hill said anything magical, but because naming the pattern precisely, giving it specific language, stripped it of the power that invisibility gives it. You cannot fight what you cannot see. You cannot redirect what you have not identified. And you cannot achieve consistency at the level of results until you first achieve consistency at the level of thought. ¿Te suena? Of course it does. Because somewhere in your own experience, you have felt the version of that belief. The version that says, maybe you're getting a little too hopeful. The version that reminds you of the last time things looked promising and then didn't work out. The version that sounds like realism but functions like sabotage. Now, here is the essential thing to understand about consistency as Hill defined it, because it is almost certainly not what you think it is. Most people, when they hear the word consistency, imagine a daily schedule, a morning routine, a list of habits to check off. And those things have value, they genuinely do. But they are the surface expression of consistency, not its source. The source of true, lasting, wealth-producing consistency is not behavioral. It is mental. It is the daily, deliberate, emotionally charged practice of holding a single, specific, burning desire in the forefront of conscious thought until it sinks deep enough into the subconscious to become a governing instruction. Hill called this the definite chief aim. Not a goal, not a wish, not a vague aspiration toward financial improvement. A specific, declared, emotionally alive statement of exactly what you intend to achieve, by what specific means, and within what time frame. A statement so precise that the subconscious mind cannot mistake it for ambiguity, and therefore cannot default to its old patterns. A statement read aloud, with feeling every morning before the world gets access to your attention, and every night before sleep, when the door between conscious and subconscious mind stands at its most open. This is not a metaphor for positive thinking. This is a technical instruction for subconscious reprogramming based on the documented experience of the most successful human beings of the 20th century. And it works with, or without your belief in it, the same way gravity works with or without your belief in it, because it operates at the level of function, not opinion. Why do those who try hardest fall further? Because they try hard at everything except the one practice that would make all other efforts coherent. They try hard at their work, at their relationships, at their health, at their various projects and ambitions, but they never try hard, never apply consistent discipline at the level of the mental instruction that governs all of those domains simultaneously. And so the efforts remain disconnected, each one pulling in a slightly different direction, none of them aligned by a clear governing intention. And the result is a life of busy exhaustion rather than productive accumulation. Let me be direct with you about something that the comfortable teachers of success will not say. There is a version of your life that does not get better. There is a version where the years continue to pass, where the effort continues without the compound return it should be generating, where the gap between who you are and who you know you could be grows wider and more painful with each passing season, until it becomes the defining grief of your existence. The grief of a life unlived at its full potential. The grief of knowing in the private honesty of your own mind that you had the capacity for something larger, something more powerful, something that would have mattered beyond the span of your own single lifetime, and that you let that capacity sit inside you like an unopened gift until it was too late to open it. Hill witnessed this grief in old men. He sat with men at the end of their productive years who had all the appearance of comfort, but who carried in their eyes a specific quality of sorrow that money could not address. It was the sorrow of unlaunched potential, of the book never written, of the business never built, of the conversation with their children that was always going to happen next year, of the version of themselves they had always been about to become right up until they ran out of time to become it. Escucha, that grief is not inevitable. It is not the natural consequence of being human. It is the specific consequence of inconsistency, of allowing the days to run without deliberate direction, of letting the default program play out unchallenged until the program has consumed all the available time. The good news, and this is the news that Hill spent his entire life delivering, is that the program can be changed at any age, in any circumstance, with any level of current resources, because the subconscious mind does not care about your age or your bank balance or your past failures. It only cares about what you feed it consistently with emotional intensity right now. But there is a cost of waiting, and that cost compounds in exactly the same way that wealth compounds when the mental foundation is right. Every day of delay is a day in which the old pattern runs without interruption, deepening its grooves, making its pathways more automatic, increasing the effort required to redirect it. Every month that passes without a deliberate, definite chief aim is a month in which your subconscious accepts your silence as consent to continue operating on its current instructions. Every year of inconsistency is a year of evidence accumulating in the wrong direction. Evidence that your life looks like it looks because that is simply what you're capable of, which is the most dangerously a human mind can believe about itself. And meanwhile, time is the one creditor that does not negotiate, does not extend terms, does not respond to your good intentions or your sincere regrets. It simply continues. And if the mental work does not begin in earnest now, not eventually, not when circumstances are slightly better, not when you feel more ready, the cost of delay will eventually exceed what is recoverable. Why do those who try hardest fall further? Because they wait until they feel ready to do the inner work. And readiness is a feeling that the old program is designed to withhold indefinitely, because the old program survives only as long as it runs unchallenged. Here is where the conversation turns toward the practical, toward the specific, toward the concrete mechanics of what Hill discovered and documented and made available to any human being willing to apply it with consistency it demands, because everything said so far about the problem, about the stakes, about the cost of delay, has a counterpart. A solution that is equally specific, equally powerful, and equally available regardless of your current position. The first and foundational principle is the definite chief aim, and it deserves more than a passing mention because most people misunderstand it almost completely. A definite chief aim is not a vision board. It is not an affirmation. It is not a motivational poster on your wall. It is a written, specific, emotionally charged declaration of the exact outcome you intend to produce, including the precise amount of wealth you intend to accumulate, the specific date by which you intend to accumulate it, and the specific service or value you intend to provide in exchange for it. Hill was emphatic on this last point because it addresses the most common psychological block around wealth, the unconscious belief that wanting money is somehow selfish or immoral. By defining the value you will give in exchange for the wealth you seek, you align desire with service, and the subconscious resistance that moral ambivalence creates dissolves. Write it by hand, not typed, because the act of handwriting engages the subconscious mind more directly than typing does. Write it in the present tense as though it is already so. Write it with every specific detail you can bring to it. The number, the date, the method, the feeling. Then read it aloud with genuine emotional conviction every morning upon waking and every night before sleep. Not as a ritual you perform because you were told to, as a genuine full-hearted declaration of where your mind is going, regardless of where your current circumstances appear to be. This is autosuggestion, and it is not soft. It is the hardest mental discipline most people will ever attempt, precisely because it requires holding a thought with consistent emotional intensity in the face of external evidence that contradicts it. The bank statement that still shows the old numbers, the relationships that still reflect the old patterns, the mirror that still shows the face of someone who has not yet arrived at the destination. The practice of autosuggestion demands that you choose the internal instruction over the external evidence every single day, with enough emotional force that the subconscious receives it as command rather than suggestion. Hill watched this process transform men who had been financially stagnant for decades, not because they suddenly found better opportunities, though better opportunities did arrive, but because the subconscious, once given a clear and consistent instruction, begins to selectively perceive the environment in ways that reveal pathways that were always there but invisible to a mind running a different program. This is not mysticism. This is the documented, observable function of the reticular activating system of the human brain, which filters the roughly 11 million bits of information per second that arrive at your senses and selects based on your dominant thoughts and intentions, which few thousand bits reach your conscious awareness. Change the dominant thought, and you literally change what you perceive as possible. Mira, the mastermind principle that Hill documented, is the second great lever of consistent wealth creation, and it is almost universally underestimated. Carnegie told Hill directly that his entire fortune was the product not of his individual mind, but of the mastermind group he had assembled. A specific alliance of individuals whose knowledge, skills, and energies combined in a way that produced something greater than the sum of its parts. Hill observed this phenomenon repeatedly across the lives of the most successful people he studied. None of them achieved great wealth alone. All of them, without exception, had created or joined a deliberate alliance of minds harmonized around a common purpose. The reason this works at the level that Hill described is not merely practical, not merely a matter of combining complementary skills, though that is part of it. It is that a group of minds focused with genuine harmony on a specific, definite aim creates a quality of mental energy that an individual mind cannot generate alone. Hill described this as a third mind, distinct from any of the individual minds in the alliance, that becomes available when the conditions of harmony and shared purpose are met. Whether you frame this in spiritual or neurological terms, the practical result is the same: access to ideas, insights, connections, and creative solutions that would never arise from isolated individual effort. If you are currently working toward financial freedom in isolation, if your mental environment is populated primarily by people who do not share your level of ambition or who actively or passively discourage the size of your thinking, then you are carrying a burden that does not need to be carried. The weight of going against the current of your social environment is one of the heaviest invisible loads a human being can bear. It compresses the breath. It creates a constant low-level hum of social friction that drains the very energy that focused effort requires. Find your mastermind group. Seek it with the same deliberate intention you bring to any other critical business decision. Because the people whose minds you habitually share space with are not neutral. They are either compounding your trajectory or contradicting it, and there is very little middle ground. Loves? The third principle that Hill documented as essential to consistent wealth creation is what he called faith. And this word requires careful handling because it has been taken in directions that Hill did not intend. Faith, as Hill defined it in the specific context of wealth accumulation, is not religious belief and is not blind optimism. It is the deliberate cultivation of an expectation of success so consistent and so deeply embedded in the subconscious that it begins to function as a self-fulfilling instruction. It is the mental state in which possibility is processed as probability, and probability as near certainty, not because the external evidence demands this conclusion, but because the internal instruction has been repeated, with sufficient emotional intensity to override the default setting of doubt. Faith in this sense is built through the same mechanism as all subconscious reprogramming. Consistent, emotionally charged repetition of the desired thought until the desired thought becomes the dominant mental pattern. It is built through reviewing past evidence of your own capability and amplifying it in memory until it occupies more mental space than the evidence of failure. It is built through the mastermind, through the reflected confidence of people who genuinely believe in the size of your potential. And it is built through action, specifically the action of moving toward your definite chief aim before you feel fully ready. Because the act of moving despite uncertainty sends the subconscious a signal that overrides hesitation. It says we are going, and the subconscious, which takes its cues from behavior as much as from thought, begins to align its creative resources behind the declared direction. The fourth principle, and perhaps the most misunderstood of everything Hill documented, is the concept of the burning desire. Hill did not mean a vague wish for better circumstances. He did not mean a preference for wealth over poverty, the way one might prefer a warmer climate. He meant a specific, named, felt, almost physical longing for a defined outcome, held with enough intensity that it functions as a consuming force rather than a background preference. The desire that keeps you awake not with anxiety, but with creative urgency. The desire that makes the price of consistency feel small compared to the cost of its absence. The desire that, when fully formed and specifically directed, begins to exercise a selective effect on your perception and your energy, drawing your attention toward relevant opportunities and generating the specific quality of persistent effort that compounds into results over time. This quality of desire cannot be manufactured from the outside. It cannot be borrowed from someone else's story or installed by watching enough motivational content. It has to be found inside your own specific and personal relationship with what matters most to you. The freedom you want to give your family, the legacy you want to leave, the life you want your children to inherit as their baseline rather than their aspiration. When you connect the financial desire to something that has genuine emotional weight for you, Something beyond the abstract concept of money itself, the desire acquires the intensity that makes it functional rather than decorative. Why do those who try hardest fall further? Because their desire is not specific enough, not personal enough, not emotionally heavy enough to sustain the consistency that results require. They want better in a general way. They want more in a comfortable way. And the subconscious mind, which responds to emotional intensity, like a radio receiver, responds to signal strength, receives the message as static, and continues running the default program. The fifth principle that demands attention here is the management of fear, and specifically, the 6 fears that Hill identified as the primary destroyers of consistent financial progress. The fear of poverty, the fear of criticism, the fear of ill health, the fear of loss of love, the fear of old age, and the fear of death. Of these, the fear of poverty is the most directly relevant to financial consistency, and it operates in a way that is both obvious and deeply counterintuitive. The fear of poverty is not a motivator. Despite what many people believe, despite the intuitive logic that says fear of a bad outcome should drive you harder toward a good one, Hill documented repeatedly that the fear of poverty actually produces the very poverty it fears, because fear, held as a dominant mental state, is itself an emotional instruction to the subconscious. And the subconscious, which cannot distinguish between what you want and what you hold with the most emotional intensity, accepts the fear as the primary directive and engineers circumstances that match it. This is why people who are desperately afraid of poverty often make financial decisions that seem, from the outside, almost designed to ensure it. Not because they are irrational or self-destructive in any conscious sense, but because the subconscious is faithfully executing the loudest instruction it has been given. The solution is not to pretend the fear does not exist, not to suppress it or deny it, but to deliberately and consistently outcompete it with a stronger, more emotionally charged instruction. The burning desire for the specific positive outcome, held with more conscious intensity than the fear is held with unconscious habit. Whereas, this is why the daily practice of the definite chief aim is not optional. It is the mechanism by which you keep the positive instruction louder than the fearful one. It is the daily act of deliberate mental sovereignty over the default program of limitation. And it requires consistency, not because consistency is a virtue in the abstract, but because the fear does not take days off, and the subconscious does not maintain a positive instruction on the basis of past effort. It responds to current input. Yesterday's affirmation does not carry over into today's subconscious programming without today's renewal of it. This is the hardest truth in all of Hill's work, and it is the one most people encounter and then quietly set aside because it requires something they have been conditioned to resist: the long, patient, non-dramatic, daily practice of mental discipline with no immediately visible return. The results of subconscious reprogramming do not appear on the first day or the first week. They accumulate beneath the surface the way water carves stone, invisibly, consistently, until one day the stone yields, and the path that was always there becomes suddenly, unmistakably clear. And then the compound return of all that consistent, invisible work arrives, often with a speed and an abundance that seems to everyone who did not witness the daily practice like sudden, inexplicable luck. Hill watched this happen to Andrew Carnegie, who was once a boy working in a factory for wages that barely covered bread, and who became the richest man in the world, not because his circumstances were favorable, but because his mind was governed by a specific, consistent, emotionally charged instruction that the subconscious eventually executed with perfect fidelity. He watched it happen to Henry Ford, who had failed in business twice and was considered by many of his contemporaries to be a dreamer with no practical sense, and who built one of the largest industrial empires in human history on the foundation of a desire so specific and so persistent that it simply wore down every obstacle in its path. He documented it in scores of others whose names you know and whose names have been forgotten, but whose experience confirmed the same fundamental principle. Consistent mental instruction applied with emotional intensity and sustained over time produces results that no amount of surface-level effort without that foundation can replicate. Fíjate, here is what the practice looks like in concrete daily terms. Because the principle without the practice is merely information, and information without implementation is the most expensive luxury a person with ambition can afford every morning before any external input reaches your attention. Before the phone, before the news, before the demands of other people establish their claim on your mental energy. You sit with your written definite chief aim and you read it aloud with genuine feeling. You see the outcome as though it is present. You feel the freedom it represents in your body, in your posture, in the temperature of your chest. You spend at least 3 minutes, ideally 5, in this state of deliberate, emotionally alive, focus on the specific outcome you have declared. Then you identify the one action, the single most direct forward movement toward your definite chief aim that is available to you on this specific day, and you take it. Not the comfortable action, not the preparatory action, not the action of reading more about the action, the actual movement toward the actual outcome. And you do this every day. Not on the days you feel motivated, not on the days when external circumstances seem encouraging, every single day. Because the subconscious does not reward motivation. It rewards consistency, and consistency is the one signal that communicates to the subconscious that the declared intention is real rather than experimental. At night, in the minutes before sleep, when the conscious mind relaxes its editorial control and the subconscious stands at its most receptive, you return to your definite chief aim and you read it again. You feel it again. You hand it back to your subconscious as the last instruction of the day. The one thought that will continue its work during the hours of sleep when conscious effort is suspended, but subconscious processing continues at full capacity. This is the practice. It is not complicated. It does not require expensive equipment or specialized knowledge or the right external conditions. It requires only the consistent application of deliberate mental discipline, day after day, in the face of external circumstances that may not immediately reflect the instruction you are giving. And it produces, with the reliability of a physical law, a progressive alignment between the subconscious instruction and the external results, until the results that once seemed to belong to a different kind of person feel like the natural and expected expression of who you have become. Why do those who try hardest fall further? Because they never learned that the hardest and most important work happens in the first and last 5 minutes of every day, in the silent, private discipline of commanding their own minds. Before and after, the world has its say, because they gave everything to the external arena and nothing to the internal foundation. And a structure built without a foundation does not collapse dramatically. It settles, slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you realize that the ceiling of what seemed possible has been descending for years without your noticing. The man at the kitchen table, the one with the stone on his chest and the cold coffee and the late-night numbers that never add up. He is not a tragedy because his circumstances are hard. He is a potential tragedy because he does not yet know that the stone has a name, and the name is inconsistent mental instruction, and the stone can be lifted. Not by someone else, not by a change in external circumstances, not by a lucky break or a better economy or a more supportive employer. It can be lifted by him, beginning tomorrow morning, before the world wakes up, with a piece of paper and a written declaration and 5 minutes of genuine, emotionally alive commitment to the outcome. He was built to achieve a. The question is not whether the method works. The method works. It has been working for the people who apply it since before Hill documented it, and it will continue working after every trend in self-improvement has come and gone, because it operates at the level of human function rather than human fashion. The question is whether you will apply it with the consistency it requires, or whether you will carry it as interesting information to the next comfortable stopping point, where the old program quietly resumes its operation and the days continue their familiar pattern. Your children are watching. Not the version of you that reads about change, the version of you that makes it. Your future self, the one who will look back from whatever vantage point the years ultimately provide, is waiting to know which version of you showed up when the information was clear and the choice was present and the moment was exactly now. Why do those who try hardest fall further? Because they never forced themselves to be consistent at the level that matters most, because they treated mental discipline as optional, and then wondered why the results that mental discipline produces never arrived, because they confused the comfort of good intentions with the compounding power of daily, deliberate, non-negotiable practice. You now know what they did not know, or rather, what they knew but did not apply. And that distinction between knowing and applying, between understanding a principle and forcing yourself to execute it consistently, regardless of how you feel on any given morning. That distinction is the entire distance between the 97 and the 3. It is the distance between the life you are living and the life you were built for. It is the distance that has always been crossable for anyone willing to cross it, one consistent day at a time, beginning exactly here, beginning exactly now, with a clarity of desire and a command of mind that no external circumstance has the power to override. The legacy you leave is not made in the dramatic moments. It is built in the invisible, unglamorous daily practice of choosing the instruction your subconscious receives over the instruction your fear would give it. Built in the morning minutes before the world has its say. Built in the written declaration that your subconscious cannot ignore if you will not let it. Built in the consistency that transforms potential from a word you use to describe what you might someday become into the actual, tangible, lived reality of what you are. That is the secret. That has always been the secret, and it has been available to you every single day. waiting for the consistency that makes it real.